Okay, we'll call a special council meeting to order. And the first item, of course, is the Open Government Initiative. Dan, I believe you're going to introduce this.
Thank you, Mayor Zare. Good afternoon, members of council. I'm pleased to be here to present to you on the subject of open government today. And I would say the presentation is timely. If you were reading last week's papers, you will see that the province, through the Premier's office, made a significant announcement about the province's initiative in pulling together an open government engagement team to look at how the province can be more open with data, with information, and with public engagement. But might I humbly suggest to you today that that announcement was not groundbreaking. In fact, it was just another in a series of announcements that are coming out from federal, provincial, and municipal governments around efforts that they're making to become more open, or in other words, more accountable and transparent to their citizens. And I also suggest that this has been an evolution that's been underway now for at least 30 years within the province, and it has its basis in freedom of information legislation. But what I would say is different about where we stand today is that the next leg in our journey is one that will be heavily enabled by technology, by innovation, and by collaboration. And that's what I would suggest sets apart where we are on the journey with where we've been in the previous number of years. We're here today for two reasons. The first is that we have a mandate to be here. Back in 2007, City Council approved an accountability and transparency policy, and that policy said that we should come back within this term for an update and a review, and that review is underway. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we see the opportunities that lie ahead to do more in this area using innovation, technology, and collaboration, and so we'd like to start that dialogue with Council today. This slide lays out the presentation content, and as I've said, essentially we're looking for your initial reactions to what we're tabling today. We anticipate that we'll be in front of Council a number of times before we have a final plan and a final policy. And we'll split the presentation into two parts. I'll take the first half and focus on the highlights from our discussion paper. I have about 13 slides, and we'll take about 20 minutes for that. And then we have 3 questions that are intended to generate some discussion and feedback from Council. Following that, Yuri Konga, who is sitting behind me, will deliver an overview of the Open Data Initiative. He has about 10 slides. We'll take about 15 minutes, and then we have 2 questions that we'd like to pose to you to receive your feedback. I'll then conclude by very briefly summarizing our approach to stakeholder engagement and the next steps in our work plan. So in your packages, you have a discussion paper, which is the first appendix behind the staff report, that was prepared by staff and really is intended to provide a broad survey of open government. It talks a bit about the history, the rationale for and challenges of open government, a comparative analysis of some of the leading thinkers in this area, a draft framework for the city, and then a summary of the existing work that's been underway within the organization. We'll touch only on the highlights of that discussion paper over the course of the next few slides. So here's a definition which has been widely used to define really what open government means. And I think the key point to make here is that definitions of open government are almost always synonymous with definitions of accountability and transparency. That's a key consistent element that we see between concepts of open government and concepts of accountability and transparency. So what do we mean when we talk about accountability in government? It simply means that we have rules and guidelines in place that ensure government is able to justify its actions to its citizens. Transparency also means that we have information and decisions freely and openly available for public review and for discussion. It's as simple as that. As I've said, these concepts are not new, and I would humbly suggest to you today that municipal governments are in fact the most open level of government when you compare them to the province and the federal government, and I hope you'll see through the discussion paper that Kitchener has already made strides over the past number of years in an effort to become more accountable and transparent. That said, it's also fair to say that citizens are holding government to higher levels of accountability or standards of accountability, and technology is now making it possible to achieve even higher levels of transparency. And so that's where our focus lies over the next couple of years. In the discussion paper, we provide a bit of a timeline, a legislative timeline that outlines some of the key pieces of federal and provincial legislation which have really been focused on concepts of accountability and transparency. And I've summarized on this slide in those 3 bullets the 3 pieces of provincial legislation that have significantly changed how municipalities view accountability and transparency. And I'd say that the most significant one is the third one, the most recent one, which was amendments to the Municipal Act made in 2006 that required for the first time all Ontario municipalities to have an accountability and transparency policy. So City Council took up that mantle in 2007, convened an ad hoc committee which had broad representation from the media, from the public, and for members of council, and develop the city's first policy. And although he's not here, Councillor Gazzola was actually the council appointee to that committee, so he would remember well the process that that committee went through to develop that policy over the course of a year. But I think what's also notable is that in the past, accountability and transparency was largely driven by legislative mandates. Increasingly, it's being driven by voluntary efforts. And one of the leading organizations in this area is the Open Government Partnership, which is a coalition of nation states that have voluntarily signed on to a pledge and a commitment to become more open levels of government. And Yuri will no doubt talk about that more as we get onto the open data section. So the document outlines a number of things that have been done that I would suggest demonstrate a commitment to principles of accountability and transparency within the City of Kitchener. This slide just contains a few of the examples from the discussion paper, and I'll highlight even just one, and that's the most recent one, which is the web streaming of council and committee meetings. And we would suggest that this is in fact an improvement in accountability and transparency, as it increases the amount and the quality of information that's available to citizens on council and committee deliberations, and it also makes use of technology to improve accessibility of that information to our citizens. So while it may be self-evident in the discussion paper, we talk a bit about why we believe this work is important, why it's important to the city organization, and why it's important to the public. This slide outlines 5 reasons. There are no doubt more. I won't touch on them, but I'll use the next 2 slides to give some examples of how I think this demonstrates the importance of the work. And the first example will relate to the first point, which is new and innovative solutions. And that means that when you allow citizens and businesses the power to easily obtain government information, they are better positioned to develop informed and creative solutions to problems or opportunities that face their community. I'll also give an example of the last bullet, which is enhanced public participation. And this simply means that where you, especially using technology, create greater opportunity for participation in council deliberations, hearings, or public consultations, you can increase the validity of public input that council uses to make its decisions. So I'm quite a fan of this first example. You may have heard of it before, and this is an app that was developed through Code for America for the City of Boston initially. And the problem that this app was intending to solve is one that relates to fire hydrants. And so apparently Boston was having a problem whereby the huge number of fire hydrants they had across the city were becoming snowed in the wintertime, and either it required an expenditure of municipal funds to clean them out, or even worse, in the case of a fire, the firefighters would show up and it took time to clear out that fire hydrant and delay their fire response. So some fellows for Code for America were brought in and basically developed an app that was using open data that provided a complete inventory of all of the fire hydrants across the city, and using a bit of fun and a gaming approach, provided an opportunity for people to adopt a hydrant, I believe to name it, and to take some personal responsibility for it. Ultimately, the impact was a reduction of cost for the municipality and an improvement to fire response time, and it came at a relatively low cost to the City of Boston. But perhaps even more importantly, since that time, this app has been made available to municipalities across North America, and again, using typically GIS data from their open data sets, are able to leverage this application really at no or minimal cost to their organizations. Another example, and you can't really see the details, I don't think that's necessarily important, is a screenshot from the Open Budget Oakland interactive web tool, which was developed for the City of Oakland in California. And this is a tool that was developed in concert with the open data community, which is very much active in Oakland, California. So this is a web tool, and it's intended to promote a deeper understanding of the city's budget so that citizens and stakeholders can be more informed when they engage in public debate around spending priorities. So the process starts with an interactive dialogue with members of the community to learn about what aspects of the budget are most important to them. And then using data that's made publicly available, they develop tools, reports, schematics that make budget information more easily understood. Ultimately, any citizen anywhere with internet access in the City of Oakland can obtain information about the budget, where money is being spent and why. And they found that in doing this, it increases levels of understanding, a higher degree of accountability for the city administration, and greater levels of participation for people reviewing or simply asking questions about the city budget. As I mentioned, there are a number of organizations that are providing leadership in this area. We've identified the 5 that our research uncovered as those that are really pioneering the way. And while they all vary somewhat in their approach and visions, you'll see in our document that there's a table that compares and contrasts their frameworks and the key elements of it. And what we found when we distilled it all down is that ultimately there are striking similarities between the approaches that all 5 of these organizations have taken. And out of that, we identified 3 common principles that we saw across all of the frameworks that we took a look at. These are the 3 open government principles that were common to all of the organizations that we surveyed. And I think what's really encouraging to me here is that the first and the third are principles that already form part of our accountability and transparency policy. And the second, while not a new body of work for the city, is new in terms of our consideration for including that within an open government framework. So again, to remind Council, transparency means that information and decisions are open and freely available. Participation means that we seek to mobilize citizens to engage in public debate, provide input, and make contributions that lead to more responsive, innovative, and effective governance. And accountability means that we have rules and guidelines in place that allow us to justify our actions when called upon. So in a few minutes, we'll have some questions for you, and one of them is, do you accept that these are 3 overarching principles that should form the basis for our work on open government? But if we do for a moment accept that that's the case, the next question that comes out of that is, what actions does this imply? It's fine to have principles and to have them defined, but it should translate into a meaningful body of work that will make a difference for citizens. And this is a question that we do plan to go to the public with, but in the meantime, we've identified some slides which should give you a flavor for the type of work that could be initiated by the city to support these 3 principles. And these are defined in a little bit more detail in the document, and so I won't highlight all of them. Perhaps I'll just speak to one of them on each of the next 3 slides to give you a flavor for what we're talking about. So again, if transparency is about making information open and freely available for public review and discussion, we believe a key supporting action will be the launch of open data within the City of Kitchener. And for those that aren't familiar with open data, basically it's the idea that data should be freely available to anyone to use, to reuse, and to republish as they wish, without restrictions, things like copyright or access control. Opening up government data can help to enlist solutions to government problems, and indeed this is where we've seen it to be most effective. Not simply where the data is released to the public hoping there will be some use found for it, but it's in fact when government identifies a problem, like the one in Boston with fire hydrants, and then provides data to the public to enlist their assistance in finding creative solutions for it. We have already committed to this as a priority action. Yuri will talk about it in more detail, and we're looking to launch our portal and our initial data sets in early 2014. In terms of participation, one of the opportunities that we have ahead of us is greater use of electronic participation or e-participation. And this would consist of the development of a portfolio of participation tools and channels to provide more extensive contribution to public debate and dialogue. So this would go beyond the use of the website and social media, which is quite often used by the city for community engagement. It may include a number of tools, and you may have seen some of these in your travels or as you looked at other municipalities. One that's being used increasingly broadly across municipal space is a tool called Mind Mixer. You may want to take a look at it, but it's simply a tool that's useful in generating ideas within the community, gathering input, and then measuring results in terms of the actions that are being taken. In terms of increasing accountability, I'll just speak about accessible reporting as one potential direction that we might take. And basically this means taking a multi-channel approach to providing city reports in a format that is more accessible and understandable by members of the public. And this could take many different shapes and forms, but one of the ones that we've considered is some sort of an automated process whereby people could sign up with the city for certain keywords. So let's say on the issue of Victoria Park washrooms, if someone had an interest in that, they could automatically be notified and have information pushed out to them when the item appears on a council agenda or when there's communications coming out from the city on it, so that the onus is not so much on them to chase that information, but is being pushed out based on the preferences that they identify. Quite often it's helpful to translate concepts into a visual representation, and so we've taken a crack at an initial framework for open government at the City of Kitchener, which represents all of the various components. So you can see at the center will be the goal or the vision of our open government initiative, and the 3 principles that we've talked about are identified in the overlapping circles. We've referenced collaboration and innovation as 2 key supporting conditions, and then spiraling outward from this framework, we see the potential activities to support those directions. At the bottom, we've identified open data as a key supporting initiative, and we suggest that the balance remains to be defined through this process. A vision statement for open government is intended to provide the overarching direction for our work in this area. And what's on the slide represents one possible vision statement, and we believe it captures the 3 key principles and also the supporting conditions. And you can see them referenced in the keywords in that vision statement. So, Mr. Chair, I've intended to keep the presentation at a fairly high level. There's lots more detail in the discussion paper, but at this point, I'd be happy to turn it back to you. And on the slides, we've identified the 3 areas that we'd appreciate feedback from committee today.
Okay, I have one question at this point. Councillor Rubanovic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And Dan, thank you for the presentation. As you know, this is something that I know I and others have been paying much attention to and are very happy to see it here finally. In terms of the work that's been done on this, has this been primarily a project involving IT and clerks and under your jurisdiction, or has it been a more comprehensive discussion around the organization yet?
Through Mr. Chair, I would say it's been a comprehensive discussion. We have an internal steering committee that has representation from all departments at a fairly senior level. So outside of our department, our head of economic development, our head of planning, our head of transportation planning, and in fact our CAO sit on the steering committee to provide broad perspective. We have Yuri, who is also providing some expert support and advice. And I think we also want to be mindful that it would be incredibly hypocritical to develop an open government policy without consulting broadly on the policy. And so we're here today to gauge your initial reaction. With your concurrence, we'll go out starting in November for a broader community consultation.
Okay. And yeah, and I know there's some desire for that. I mean, I've had some conversations with people in the community who are doing some work in this area, and I know they're quite keen to help us out with it going forward. You talk about the potential for launching a portal in early 2014 with some initial data sets, and I think that's fantastic. Are we looking at how we're going to come up with those data sets? I mean, I know one of the things I've heard from speaking to people in the community is they've liked the approach that, for example, the province has suggested now that the region has taken, which is to solicit opinion from the community in terms of the kinds of data they'd like to see initially, as opposed to the approach that some municipalities have taken, which is, well, here's the data we think you should have to start things out with, and they don't see that quite as favorably.
Right. Through the chair, Yuri will speak in some detail about the approach we plan to take for open data. My intention here was to focus on the broader framework for which open data is one supporting initiative, so I think he'll answer that question as a part of his overview.
Okay, and the last question, and I think this is one that probably excites me the most, is this the whole focus around being participatory and you know, looking at how we can better engage the citizen voice, e-participation. I mean, using electronic tools, seeing how open innovation fits in with that. You mentioned Mind Mixer as one, and I'm aware of that. Going forward, would we do a more comprehensive look at, you know, what tools are out there to help us with this kind of work, and what some of the best practices or experiences from other municipalities are?
Through the chair, just as we're doing with open data, I would suggest that if our consultation comes back with that result, that e-participation should be a priority for us under that participation principle. We'll do exactly the same thing, develop a more robust plan, consult broadly around that, look at various approaches and tools, what others are doing, and ultimately, as we are with open data, come back to council with specific recommendations. Okay,
great. I know one of the arguments that's often made for you know, really going this route and making information available for the masses is, in the past, when somebody really wanted to dig into an issue, they would have to go the route of an FOI request, as an example, and then it would get considered. Does it meet the parameters? Information would be made available, but then it would typically be made available only to that party. Whereas, you know, in this kind of scenario, I guess, you know, we're really looking at putting everybody on an equal playing field in terms of putting, deciding what that information is that should be out there, as long as it doesn't meet any confidentiality restrictions. And then everybody's on an even playing field and is able to make their own judgments and decisions on either a direction the city might be going or on a decision that council has made. As we look at that, though, one of the things that is always paramount in my mind is recognizing that, well, we have more and more people that are computer literate and have access to those tools. Have we contemplated as we go forward how we make sure that this is equally accessible for everyone?
So although we're just starting to grapple with it, it's the third point, I think, on that transparency direction, that there are some users of information that are quite happy to have a data set and then can work with it. Open knowledge is intended to be an extension of open data where the municipality actually has a role in visualization, in reporting on, in interpreting that information. So there are some users that have no need for that or no interest for that, but there are others who do require that, and so that could be a possible direction for us. So that not only are we proactively providing the information, but we're assisting in how that's visualized, how that's reported on, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I know there's more and more work being done in that regards to try to make sure that information is available in a way that's user-friendly and readable. I think Edmonton actually does a really good job on their website of doing some dashboarding and basically updating everything live, or certain things live in terms of information for the public. So it's pretty powerful. And the last question is, will all of this work also in some respects help us as an organization get better at what we do? Because I think right now there's all sorts of data out there, some of which we use on a regular basis, quite frankly. I would suggest a lot that we probably don't. So as we come to terms with this more and more, and perhaps people start developing apps and looking at it, do we think that we're going to get better at using this info to help us become more effective in managing the organization as well, or I guess more appropriately, help you and the staff team manage the organization appropriately?
Through the chair, I think that will absolutely be an outcome, because it does force us to understand what data do we actually have care and control over. What's the quality of that data? How do we automate the collection and the dissemination of that data? So even though it may be initiated for the purposes of making it publicly available, there's a whole lot of work we'll have to do to gain comfort around that data and knowledge around it, and so that will be definitely a benefit within the organization.
Great, thank you very much.
Councillor Ioannidis, just ignore the question on the screen right now. This is question period time.
Okay. Thank you, Dan, for your presentation. Councillor Vrbanovich touched upon some of the questions that I really wanted to ask, and thanks for answering those. This is something I think is really interesting and intriguing. I think it's the way of the future, and it's important for us to get this right. One of the obstacles we always come across as council and as well as city staff is we have residents who say, well, I never heard of this information, or how come this information ain't accessed to me? How are we going to go about letting the public know about this approach that we're going to be taking?
So what we're suggesting for committee is that we start with a fairly focused outreach, so we understand in the next phase who we need to be engaging with. One of the things that we want to consider is, as we go out for the next strategic plan and engage the community very broadly, what role this information has to play in that consultation. So I don't know that we have an answer for your question today, but again, I think it would be hypocritical for us to launch an open data initiative at the city and have no awareness publicly around it. And so as we move from this phase into the next one, we're going to think very carefully about how we build knowledge, build support for, and obtain feedback from the community around it. The citizen survey, though, and the strategic planning update are two vehicles that are right at our disposal.
Okay. I guess the other question is, well, you kind of sort of touched upon it in the report, that may require resources. Are we looking at having new individuals just operating on this open data information?
I don't believe at this point we're recommending that there would be any staffing impact or significant resource impact for the open data launch that we're looking at. But council may want to consider opportunities. One of the things that Yuri and I were talking about before the meeting is contests that municipalities are increasingly running where they're trying to generate interest in application development within their community, and often they'll offer prizes. Prize money is an incentive for people to participate. So is that something that we would contemplate? Perhaps. It's only one example. Those things do come at a cost, but they may return significant value to the organization over time.
Okay, that's great. That's kind of the thoughts that I was hoping you would mention, because I think there is a good opportunity, as Councillor Urbanovich had said, that open data will create some efficiency. So anyways, thank you.
Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Good presentation. I like where we're going with this. Just a couple questions before Yuri makes his presentation. So the way I'm understanding this now, so really, although I kind of loathe business terms, we're looking at the low-hanging fruit of information that we can publish in the short term with the strategy for the long term. Is that right?
You're talking about open data?
The data, sorry, the data only. Yes, the open data.
I'd back it up even a step to say we're looking to understand what's of interest to the community, and then our goal will be to publish that first, and we'll start with what's available immediately. We have no interest in publishing data that there's no express interest in, and so that's not where we'll spend our time, even if it is potentially available right now. We want to understand what are the top priorities in the community.
So publishing data, and again, going back to the cost side, publishing data of any type here would most likely have a cost associated with it, which, is that correct, generally? I guess what I'm getting at is, back to Councillor Urbanovich's point as well, is us deciding what should be published. I'm assuming with one of the bullet points was open by default. I'm assuming, I hope actually, that the long-term progression here is eventually everything that can be made available publicly will be made available publicly. So the way I'm understanding it now is the reason we're not is simply because it's cost prohibitive. Is that assumption correct?
For all data, yes, that would be a fair assessment. In conversation with our IT staff, I think, for example, the GIS data sets are the ones that are potentially most easily made available publicly, and quite often it is GIS data that is being used for the development of applications. There may be other data sets that are not routinely updated or would require work, for lack of a better term, to make them publicly accessible. So we need to understand what the interest is, what the appetite is, what the conversion cost would be. But I would suggest to you that certainly we see over time the direction will be, as we're building databases, developing systems, that sort of thing, to have this ultimate end with that view in mind.
And actually, my next question, so in terms of our current infrastructure, we also have we're looking at two large software procurements in the near future. Is this being included in that in terms of open data sets and easy machine readability, that sort of thing?
What I'd suggest is that I think that's a critical question, and one that we'd probably be in a better position to respond to when we come back to you the next time with a more detailed plan around our open data launch. And so if it's acceptable, what I suggest is leave that question with us, and as we report back with our more detailed plan, those are questions that we can answer.
Yeah, no problem. And I will say that I'm happy to hear you mention GIS, because I think GIS is one of the probably the most popular information set to be out there. Last question. You mentioned Code for America, which I was happy to see because I sort of follow that initiative. Do you know of anything in Canada that sort of parallels what Code for America does?
So I'll let Yuri perhaps respond to that question when he comes up.
Certainly. I'll save that for his presentation. Thank you.
Great.
Councillor Etherington.
Yeah, Dan, a question, but just before that, I think it's great that we spend so much time talking about technology and how to improve access to government with technology. When we come right down to the basic of someone coming in here as a delegation and getting 5 minutes, or encouraging delegations even to come in here, because a lot of people are nervous about coming in, are we reviewing that whole process? Are we looking at giving them a little more time, perhaps? Or are we looking at ways within the system to encourage them rather than what I see at times, which is a procedure that discourages them? Have we looked at all of that?
We're not at that point yet in our work plan where we're at that level of detail. Open data is the exception because we had committed to that as a body of work.
Right.
As you know, the deputy clerk is coming forward with a report on the conduct of efficient and effective meetings and through a separate process in November. And I suspect that'll be a point of discussion within that meeting about how to balance the need for efficient and effective meetings with the need for public access and the perception of an open council meeting.
Right.
So to answer your question, no, we're not at that level of detail yet within our planning.
When we do that, I would suggest that we do it for the benefit of people coming in to speak to council rather than for the benefit of councillors or the benefit of staff, that's all. Sometimes I see it happening the other way around. My other question, I don't know whether this relates to your part of this report, but it does in one place talk about the use of plain language in communications. Is that part of your report or part of the following report?
No, that would form part of what we're talking about now.
Yeah. I find not a total absence, but that would be one of my criticisms of all of this written material. It's very hard to follow. And I think we need to make more effort to have more plain language, because I had read this about 3 or 4 times before I was grasping some of it. That's not really a question, but
Point taken.
thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
I have a couple of general questions. The first one, what is the cost to us to roll out this program? We've obviously have hired consultants. And can you give me some indication of how many person hours of time all of this will take?
So I hear 3 questions there. What's given rise to this work? The accountability and transparency policy, which was approved in 2007, mandated a review of that policy within this term of council. And so essentially that's what's driven this work, and what we've recognized is that accountability and transparency are fundamental principles of open government, and so we felt it would be too narrow a focus to simply limit ourselves to looking at accountability and transparency. So it was in the business plan on that basis. Secondly was how many person hours we envision this work taking. I don't have that estimate, Councillor Gazzola, but we're working on a fairly efficient timeline to get this work done, looking to be back to council by January with basically the outcomes of our review and of our consultation. And in terms of consulting, there's really minimal consulting time on this work. The discussion paper was written by city staff, and what we've recognized is that it would be more efficient for us to benefit from the assistance of someone that's launched open data work in other municipalities than for us to try and champion this cause on our own.
Well, have we hired a consultant to work with us on this?
Yes.
What is the cost of that consultant?
It's less than $25,000 for the full extent of the project.
Okay. I have another question, and it's not so much, in a way, it relates to this, and it's the status of our streaming of our council and committee meetings. Where does that stand?
So the meetings are being web streamed now. So after a committee or a council meeting, the video, the minutes, the reports, the recorded votes are all being posted. That's available to the public today. And we've committed, as we have more comfort with the system, to report back on how that might be live streamed, which is presently not being done. So that report will come to council later this fall.
How far away are we from live stream now?
My understanding is the technology is there. We're just not fully proficient yet in terms of the use of the system for web streaming, and until we get there, it wouldn't make sense for us to try and move ahead with live streaming.
Wouldn't it be more transparent to be live stream?
Absolutely, and I think we all recognize that that's most definitely the direction that we need to be going.
So when do we go there?
Again, because we're encountering some challenges right now working with the web streaming. It's new for our staff, and they're working out those bugs. We've just done a few meetings now through that process, and so once we have a level of comfort there, we'll be back in front of council to outline what the process will be to get to live streaming.
I just want to comment also on this, and I understand it's going to be something that you're looking at, is how we do treat our delegates. I'd also hope when we're looking at that, I understand that most of the other area municipalities do allow delegates more than a 5-minute window. Is that something that you can look at, or you will look at when you're going through this process?
I think what I can do is take it back and talk to the clerk and the deputy clerk about whether or not that should come forward through their review of meeting processes, and that review is coming back in November, or alternatively through this process.
Okay, I would appreciate if you could look at that, because it seems we rarely have a delegate speaking that we don't have to sort of cut them off before they're done, and I would like to see us review that without having to pass a notice of motion and all that. My final question deals with this whole concept of open data, transparency, and all that. And yet, over the years, I get somewhat annoyed by our media releases, which only report on one side of an issue. I look upon them as marketing reports as opposed to communications. If we're really open about things, when an issue is reported upon by our staff, we're trying to advise the public of what is transpiring. Aren't there 2 or more sides to every story? And shouldn't that be part of our communication?
I would say it's not a question that I can answer today, but if it's something, if it's a question, and this is the purpose that we're here, Councillor Gazzola, that if it's a question that's of interest to all of council or to council, it's something certainly that we can take back and take a look at.
Okay, I wasn't laughing at you, and that's fine. It's just a question that, it's, perhaps you can look at that. Yeah, thank you.
I'll just make one comment on the last part. I think the communications that go out are usually designed, and I think appropriately, to present the collective decision that has been made by council. There certainly is always debate on what goes into that decision, but once the council has made a decision, that's the decision of the corporation and of this council. I'll just leave it at that for now. So we have 3 questions that are going to be posed to us as collectively. The first one is on the screen right now. Do you agree that the organization should build upon existing efforts to increase openness to the extent outlined in the discussion paper? I realize that some of you have already spoken to that in your questions and commentary. Is there anything further that anyone would like to comment on in that regard? Councillor Verbanovich.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. In one word, the answer for the first part of it is yes. On the second part, I think one of the things that's really important as we go down this path, and if this is a path that collectively is decided upon by council, there needs to be significant buy-in to this at the senior levels of the organization. So, not just at the CAO and DCAO, but at the director level and below, in order to make this work and to make it successful. Again, as I talk to colleagues in different cities who have done different amounts of this, and to people who are involved in open government, the one thing I hear is, if there isn't that significant level of buy-in from the leadership of the organization, both political and staff, it quickly becomes a questionable effort in the eyes of the public. And so, you know, if we're going to go down there, we need to make sure that that commitment is there, the buy-in is there, and we clearly understand what the resources are that are necessary to make it work.
Okay, so I think that's it. It's commentary. Thank you. Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Good presentation. I appreciate the overview. I think a couple of points. We've spoken about multi-channel, and I think there's a lot of people in the community that for whom tech is still something that intimidates them. So we need to really take extra pains to push this out in a way that reaches people that are tech averse, if I could use that term. The other issue is that we have to really model the engagement behavior all the way through. So while we're seeking, I like the idea of looking for what's helpful information, we really have to take extra pains at the front-end load of this whole process to ask people about what they want from government and what they expect. And I think that there's surveys that are getting at that. This is another slice of that. We don't want to lead the witness in a sense. We really have to give them some options though, and perhaps a menu of things like that as suggestions, but we really have to take extra care in that step.
Councillor Anitis.
Question one, do I agree? Yes, I agree. What concerns me is, I guess what I'm really worried about is with open data and among my fellow council members, we usually have, when we have these discussions, it tends to lead to a few members who have certain opinions and points of views to be put across, and I'm just concerned whether or not this will be a collective version, like as what Mayor Zaire had mentioned about with our news releases, because I'm just worried about that when there's a constant attention to certain issues and that's always being brought up by certain members, they always tend to be in the reports, they always tend to be in there where it's the collective will of council is never, that's not what is in their representation. So how do we correct that so it doesn't influence the open data? I know that's a tough question.
Not sure.
Through the chair, I don't see any of the feedback we've received today as altering the direction that we're going. I think if one of the principles around transparency that we're trying to achieve is that information on council's deliberations is open, on their decisions is open, that sort of thing, when we come back to you, we'll be talking about how we believe we'll achieve that. And we'll look at this question that's been posed around media releases, how they fit with that, whether there's any conflict there, how they can be strengthened to support that direction. So I think we can fit that question into the types of questions we're asking. I'll let council know if there's a direction being articulated by individual members that would seem to be at odds with the direction we were proposing, and then look for direction from all of committee on that.
Okay, that's great. But I also just want to make a little comment. It's sometimes when certain members don't always are vocal, that means they're kind of happy with what certain way things are going. So I just don't want to tend the ones that are always constantly saying naysayers have an influence on the system, and that's my concern. Okay, thank you.
My own comment is that, first of all, I totally agree with the direction we're going. I think it is absolutely essential, and it is an extension of what we had already in place. I would, it's not even a concern, it's more of an observation and perhaps even a prediction in terms of the level of expectation we have of the amount of, the number of people and the amount of information that those people will actually access and do something about. It may increase, and I emphasize the word may, increase the number of people who actually are engaged and access that information and become informed. But I suggest it will probably still be a limited number of people who will take the time to look at all of the information before coming to their own conclusions. And in terms of the accessing of the information to assist the city, I'm looking forward to that. But in terms of simply being more informed about the issues, I think that we just put a little bit of a caution on the level of expectation that we have, that there are going to now be thousands more people that are going to be looking at everything that is coming out of the city. Still necessary. I have three more on, it's on the second. Was there anything further on the first question? Because I got three. Okay, Councillor Yanetsky.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation, Dan. It's very interesting. I'm glad to see that this discussion report is before us, and in the form that you've presented. I haven't in my years seen anything like this unfold. I think back in my earlier years, back to the 60s, when really no information was provided by government. It was very, very limited. In fact, that's what started it all, was the ratepayer groups and the taxpayer groups that were objecting to developing and redeveloping in terms of zone changes or whatever. And they were trying to get information, and that's what basically got a lot of the ball rolling. This is back a half a century, now we're talking. So that resulted in, I guess, governments, more at the municipal level I'm talking, trying to provide information in terms of what's happened to the community, and that's how the ratepayer groups all started. It was all back in the late 60s and in the 70s. Transparency has been around for quite a while, in my opinion. If you look at information that was available during election time, as an example, in the 60s, if you wanted to know whether you're on the voters list, you either went down to the local library and looked up the list, or you just went down the street and looked on the telephone poles, and they had the whole list of names in terms of whether you're on a list for voting or not. I mean, that's transparency that was taking place then from a government level to some degree. But on the other hand, as time evolved, Privacy Acts came in and provided certain restrictions, and now you have to try to balance out what's public information and what's not public information. So yes, we have grown over 50 years in terms of moving forward and trying to be transparent, accountable. These words maybe weren't as used back then as much as they are being used now, but as I see it from my perspective, yes, they were. And even here in the city of Kitchener, when I started, there was transparency and there was openness. People on planning committees and housing committees and heritage committees started back in the 70s being representatives from the community. They were sitting on those committees. It wasn't just all of council member. Like right now when we have planning committee and infrastructure, it's all council members. Back then, the public was involved, clearly, although council was involved as well. There was that opportunity for them to be available and participate. Now, granted, over the last 20 years, or whatever the exact number is, we have now come into the age of the information age. And such technology has become available to us to make it easier, be more informative, have excellent accessibility to a lot of information, and is just multiplying left and right now, that I think to some degree we get bombarded with too much information. You can only absorb so much, and with the time that you have, you can only accumulate so much. However, your choices are there to investigate and research and to move forward. So in terms of the question, yes, I agree with it. I think we should move forward on it. It's nothing new. It's been around for many, many years. It's just it's now come nicely into a package here before us and for discussion purposes. I don't recall this ever being discussed for, in my knowledge here in participation in municipal government. Also a comment that was made by Councillor Gazzola about communication. I've already found it bizarre, I think, to hear an announcement made collectively from council in terms of a decision on a issue or a topic. Yet when you read the paper the next day, there's another side of perspective that's provided that our communication didn't bring forward. So that's something I think needs to be examined. As you mentioned, you would take a look at that. So concerns, well, I've just sort of highlighted them, one or two, but I think moving forward on this in terms of discussion and getting more involvement with the public, I think is a step forward. Thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, very quickly. When I spoke, I didn't really answer the question, but I mean the obvious answer to this question is yes. And I don't think we can ever get to the point where we're too open. So it's something that I think we have come a long ways, and there's always a long ways to go. So I think a number of concerns have been listed, and I'm confident that you and your committee will deal with them. Thanks.
Councillor Urbanovich.
Thanks. I guess I just want to comment further on this issue of the role of communications, because it's always been my understanding, and certainly the practice that's been adopted by council, that communications role is to communicate, as you said, Mr. Mayor, the joint decision of council. And sometimes individuals around this horseshoe like what that decision is, and sometimes they don't, but all of us have had the opportunity to participate in a democratic process. I think in the past our minutes have reflected the differences that have occurred on various issues around the horseshoe as they've been debated. Now they'll be there word for word in terms of the coverage that's kept on the website, and in fact in the future at some point will also be there live for people to watch as well. Obviously, the media is present to report things on both sides of the issue. And in addition to that, I think as members of council, we have other opportunities we can avail ourselves of to express our individual points of view. And I know, members around this horseshoe have at times expressed their viewpoints through their columns that are made available in your Kitchener, as an example, and or in the Kitchener Citizen rather. Others have written letters to the editor from time to time, and others yet use social media. So I think there's a variety of opportunities to get that information out. But I think it's important that the role of corporate communications is to convey the collective decision and wisdom of the council, regardless of what side of the issue individual members may be on. And so I would caution staff that, I haven't heard a blanket desire to start going down and pursuing that in a broad way. And so I would hope that we don't put too much effort into that.
Okay, I want to try to, I agree with that, but I want to try to stick to this. Councillor Erlinger, are you on what subject? Okay, question one. Okay. You got it.
So the first answer is yes. Second one is, in my opinion, the purpose of corporate communication is to get stuff into the media. We don't do that very often. And we don't do it because we only present a pat, formatted piece that is pretty boring. If you presented a few of the views for and against, you'd probably get more coverage. Thanks.
Okay, we'll go on to question number 2. What is your reaction to the open government framework, including proposed principles, and there were 3 of them, supporting conditions and vision, as outlined in the discussion paper, and that was on pages 1A, 18 and beyond, several pages there. And of course, do you support the use of this framework and the set of principles, etc.? Councillor Glenn Graham.
Yes and yes. I'm excited about the use of technology. I would just say again, multi-channel is the way that we have to go forward regardless of technology, but otherwise I'm very pleased at the philosophy and the mindset that's going into this.
Okay. I have no other commentary on question 2. Question 3, your thoughts on using examples of possible future supporting activities for Kitchener as a basis to explore possibilities with the community, the city staff, and other stakeholders. Are there other top-of-mind supporting priority actions? Councillor Ioannidis.
Yeah, I think yes, and I think that's a key initiative that we need to look at. I think any partnership with the in the private and in industry is important, and to create any efficiencies, and yeah, I'm full support in that. And are there any top of my mind priority actions? No, I think we're going in the right direction. I think it was a comprehensive report.
Councillor Urbanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll echo those comments on that particular issue. One, and it maybe actually belonged a little bit more so on the last point that we were covering off, but it's the notion that as we deal with making data available, that we shouldn't be putting cost barriers in place to prevent people from getting information. I mean, I think the principle should generally be that the information should be available at no cost, and I think the benefits will come to us through some of the creative things that result from hackathons that we can organize, and citizens creating apps that improve the quality of life and level of service to our citizens, and so on. And if some of that can happen without us having to actually have to go and fork over the money to do that stuff, and it can happen at a community level, I think that's how we sort of recoup some of the costs and get some of those secondary benefits.
Okay, I have no other comments on question 3, so we'll move to the next phase.
I just wanted to mention to committee members, some of you are aware that Catherine, my colleague, and I presented to a number of undergraduate and postgraduate university classes for Local Government Week last week. And I think what was a realization for me, and if you've been out of university for a few years like I have, the extent of online collaboration within the classroom. I was astounded at the voting tools that professors were using to enlist participation from students even during a lecture, forgetting about distance learning and that sort of thing. And so while I take the comment from Councillor Glenn Graham that it's not only all about e-engagement, the most single consistent message we heard from all of those classes is the gap that they see and the opportunity that they see to increase use of electronic tools for engagement. And certainly they were living that in their classroom based on the tools that they were using even during the lecture. So I'll take a moment to introduce Yuri Conga. Yuri is known to some of you. He's been working in this space for about 35 years and had 10 years within municipal government. He speaks and is an advocate on issues of open government, open data, e-government, intelligent communities, information management, and so on. He created the Open Government Framework 2.0 and also the Open Data Framework for Canada's G4 cities, which include Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Ottawa. And recently was appointed the Canadian Ambassador for the Open Knowledge Foundation, which is a global nonprofit that is recognized around the world for their leadership in open government and open knowledge. Yuri was recently appointed as an Information and Privacy Commission Access by Design Ambassador by Dr. Anne Cavoukian, Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner, and also sits on the Open Data Research Advisory Council, along with a number of industry and sector committees. He's also past president of the Urban and Regional Information Systems Association of Ontario. So Yuri has been retained in large part to work with us on our open data launch, and that's the focus of his presentation today.
Welcome, Mr. Conga.
Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. Mr. Mayor and members of council, it's a privilege to be here and present to you my little part of this presentation on the Open Data Framework, and I'm passionate about this. So if my voice starts getting a little high, just give me tone it down. In any event, I want to firstly acknowledge that Dan and his team have done an excellent job in the way that they're approaching open government. And the elements of defining the principles and the process that they're taking with some initial consultation with the community, and then more drill down consultation at a later date as the draft plan comes out. So there are many opportunities, and I think, and I want to, I'm very kind of taken by the fact that all of you can agree with the value of open government, and that you see the potential of contributing to the enhancement of what you've already been doing for quite some time. Is that open government has existed for a time, and what we're talking about now is really enhancing it and raising the bar beyond where it currently is and moving in the direction that is seen not only locally but also globally. So having said that, I want to try and provide you with a little bit of insight around open data from the point of view of what and why should we be thinking about it. And many of you have already expressed an interest or concurrence with that, so I won't spend too much time, but Dan had previously referenced the definition of open data, and I've highlighted a few key words here, being free, the ability to reuse and redistribute without too much, without too many restrictions. Because the value, when we think about the amount of money that is spent in municipal government, well, actually all levels of government, to create data that is used primarily for internal operational purposes, the value, a lot of the value in that data is not being realized by the people who are paying for it, which is the citizens. And the reason is that it's not made available. It's used internally exclusively, almost exclusively, and it doesn't benefit from being made available externally. So so it is a strategic resource, and opening it up will increase the likelihood of optimizing the money that you've spent on creating that data. The why comes to us from the Open Knowledge Foundation, who focus on three particular areas. The first is transparency, and that's a no-brainer. It's something that, as a number of you have mentioned, has been around for quite some time, and it has a history of legislation in Canada and then subsequently on Ontario as well, that impacts on the way that municipalities operate. So the next area and why you do it is the release for social and commercial value. So again, it's speaking to the fact that if you open up the data, what you're looking to achieve is to create some value both from a social point of view and ideally from a commercial point of view. And the third is it's another area that allows extended communication and collaboration and engagement with the stakeholders, the citizens and businesses of the municipality. Down the bottom, I've noted one thing, and I think it's important to understand that when we talk about open data, that doesn't mean it's the wild, wild west. Doesn't mean that all data is open. There is a filtering mechanism that has been shown and needs to happen, and quite often it's in conjunction with the existing legislation that you already have, such as MFIPA. So with MFIPA, there are exemptions to the access to information, such as personal information or proprietary information. And similarly, in the case of municipalities, there's actually been occasions where they put data out there that they didn't own. And that's one of those filters. That's one of the first filter. If you don't own it, you can't make it available because it's not yours. So those types of considerations need to be taken into account. Now, just to kind of provide a little bit of context around how pervasive this is, first of all, back in June of this year, the G8 came up with an open data charter, and kind of the bottom line for that charter talked about being open by default. So the data and information that governments have should be made open by default. Similarly, with the Open Government Partnership, which was initiated at the UN in September of 2011 by President Obama and the President of Brazil, one of their primary tenets was access to public information. All right? So we have these international, at the national level, condoning the fact that on first principles, access to information, access to data is a right of citizens. And the illustration, the map that's illustrated there is just trying to give you a graphical view of the fact that there are over 250 of these open data catalogs throughout the world. This is not something that's isolated to Waterloo region or to Ontario or to Canada. It is a global initiative. and it's happening, and it's growing. What I have witnessed in the last 2 or 3 years is the accelerated pace at which open data is happening globally. In Canada, we have the federal government, we have 4 provinces, including Ontario, and over 30 municipalities that are currently undertaking and have an open data catalog. But what does this open data community really look like in reality? It's not just the federal government. And so we have a diverse user community. I think this is kind of a simplified generalization of some of the various groups that are involved. First, we have like the research community, which includes students and professors and specialty labs that are dealing with various sector issues going on. We have the business community seeking to profit from open data, and there'll be more specifics on this aspect of it a little later. And the broader public sector for increased data sharing for efficiencies and assisting in better evidence-based decision-making. And then finally, we have the civil society and citizens, whether they use the data directly or whether they benefit from it indirectly through applications or research that's undertaken and visualizations that they can understand. This is a key stakeholder group, and we all know that ultimately that if there is no benefit back to the community, back to the citizen, why are we doing it? And I think that one of the things that becomes really important when we talk about community is that there's a lot of opportunity to kind of go beyond where we are right now, and I think that's one of the beauties of open government and open data is that the opportunities for innovation are significant. So, when we look at what our local community is, and I've just kind of illustrated here that we've got, again, the situation of government, universities, industry, and citizens. What I note, and having worked previously in the area and have affiliations with the university as well, I've noted that we haven't quite got to the point where it's a really good, well-knit, collaborative kind of community. We certainly have that opportunity, and I think that's one of the things that this initiative will lead us towards. So having enhanced connections among these various stakeholder groups, as opposed to just one talking to another, we all talk the same language and we look at opportunities collectively. So I wanted to go back to some of the key tenets that were described by the Open Knowledge Foundation as to why you would consider open data. So the first one is transparency, and I don't want to dwell on this because there's been a lot of discussion talked, and as a number of councillors noted that transparency has been with us for quite some time. But here's a couple of domain examples. So the ones that are very prevalent is in the area of budgets. Budgets, and you're kind of like, where does my money go? Those types of initiatives are happening at all levels of government and globally. And so it's not restricted to a particular level of government, it's not restricted to a geographic area. It's something that citizens and grassroots community are becoming more and more wanting to find out about how their tax dollars are being spent. And for them, it's very difficult, especially when they're handed a 200-page PDF and they don't understand either the organizational structure or finances in general, or what a capital project is as opposed to an operating expense. All of these things are foreign to the majority of the community, and we need collectively, and I say collectively because every government, I think, can do a better job than they're currently doing. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to move forward. Other areas include, and I've taken an example there from East Asia just to illustrate that it's not restricted to geographic area. In this case, it's a non-profit organization that was concerned about the quality of education, not only from the output, but also from the infrastructure, the state of the schools. And so they crowdsourced information, issues that parents had with certain institutions and issues around the crumbling infrastructure for the schools themselves. And this was in turn used by by the educational boards to work with the community and identify then priorities. Having identified the issue, now let's get together and talk about this and figure out how do we arrive at the priorities of dealing with these issues. Down below, there's an example of local open government and service metrics, this one from the city of Edmonton. And I think that's another relevant thing for people to really engage. Part of that issue is making the information very easy to read. So kind of like if you're doing metrics, red says you're not meeting your objective, green says you are, and amber says you're on the edge. So it's that type of very simple but very useful information being provided, and that can be provided through open data. And it's not just government providing that kind of dashboard. That's when you have the opportunity for community groups to take that data and to create their own dashboards, if you will. So that supplements it. And the other example was kind of a real time, here's the results of elections, this one in Scotland, that can be visualized, through a map. It's just illustrating the fact that you can have reams and reams of information, in text form, but a map like this, as an example, clearly illustrates, what the end result of and makes it more useful. The other opportunity, or the other area I wanted to speak to was the community engagement aspect of it. And I think this is, here's some few examples, and Dan had spoken to this earlier about contests, for open data, and there's a number of those. The first one started in 2008 with Washington, D.C., and it was started by the CTO, Vivek Kundra, who subsequently became the CIO for the U.S. federal government. And so the contest had $50,000 in prizes, and it had a vast variety of open data sets from Washington, and it asked the community to come up with some applications. The net result of that, and I don't remember how many applications there were, but what I did understand was that staff estimated the cost of them developing those same number of applications would have been $2 million as opposed to $50,000. Well, the reality is that's not totally equitable because many of those applications were fun applications and weren't really useful from a public service point of view. But nevertheless, it gives you kind of a directional sense of the type of value this type of exercise can be. Having said that, I think it's also important to understand that a lot of these contests don't necessarily mean that the applications are sustainable. That requires a business model. But I showed a picture, and there have been international hackathons, and I've been involved in about 3 of those since 2010, where there is collaboration happening virtually across continents on the same type of application. And you can see a site there of basically what it looks like is typically not a lot of room and a lot of computers and a lot of extension cords going on, but a great amount of activity. The interesting thing is that you don't need to be a geek, and I can't code at all. However, I do have knowledge of some issues, from the public service point of view. From me as a citizen, I have an issue because of this service not being worked really well. And what I was able to do was to contribute my perspective, provide some input into the design aspect, and also assist them with doing research. So it's important to understand that irrespective of the fact that we're developing something that may be technical, it won't succeed unless you have the non-technical people there as well. So really important. And I think, the other example there was just one of ideation, which is something that we're seeing more and more of at all levels of government. I think the open data community here is, it's early in its development, and I think we're in the position to support them moving forward. I mentioned to Dan earlier that there was a group in Toronto, a cycling group that have some issues, and they're looking at gathering open data from the city as well as combining it with some of theirs. I'm not exactly clear on what their goal is, but one of the things that when I spoke to them was that if we can set up a template regarding your project that can be replicated across Canada, that would be ideal. That's the kind of thing I think we want to look at, is the opportunities to create something that can be used by other public sector groups. So I had noted earlier that I would spend a little time just giving you some information around the economic development aspect of it. So the commercialization being one of the goals for open data. This chart illustrates actually the perspectives of business. This was not government saying this is where the economic development is going to happen. This was a study, an independent study that was undertaken by the Open Knowledge Foundation on the business views, what they perceive the economic development opportunities to be. And the top two there, the top one is actually application development, Dan had provided a couple of examples of that, and there are literally thousands of these applications that are leveraging open data, to the benefit of not only government, but as a public service. So the application development was seen as the opportunity by over 73% of the business respondents. And similarly, in the area of data analysis and visualization services, that was over 70% seen as a business opportunity. So it's this type of thing that, and we're early on. Okay, the metrics on this type of commercialization is not good. I don't think that we've got the type of data that we need to come up with very specific numbers. But directionally, just as an example, where the European Commission last year came out with a study that said that open data and related activities would generate over $50 billion worth of commercial activity in Europe. My guess is that there are many pages of assumptions to come up with that figure. However, directionally, what I'm seeing is that more and more studies are indicating that there is positive outcomes from using open data from a commercial point of view. So when we go back to provide some context around this, just wanted to reiterate the fact, and very pleased to see that all of you agreed with these principles. And as stated earlier, two of them were already there in a policy, in a 2007 policy for you, and the one about being participatory is kind of common sense, that part of having government, which is supposed to be providing public service, is that you all also have public engagement. One of the things I think that we've seen is that the public engagement isn't necessarily to the degree that the citizens would like. However, the open data is certainly most associated with the transparency aspect of it, but it also aligns itself with the other two of accountability, and opening up data allows government to be more accountable because the information is being made available, and participatory as through these hackathons or community collaborations. So what this particular slide illustrates, what the proposed actual open data framework would be. And so proper governance is essential for any initiative. It doesn't matter whether it's open data, open government, or what have you. So governance has to be there. Who's responsible for policy? Who's accountable for what? The open data portal, that is the public facing. That is the thing that the public sees through your website and how they physically access the data. The community engagement and long-term success in open data, in my humble opinion, is going to revolve around how effective your collaboration and partnership with the community is. Because if they're not supportive, if they're not in there working with you around the Open Data Initiative, it will not succeed to the degree that it should be. Standards, this is a common requirement of any data or information related project or program. And the operations kind of speaks to the process, and some of you, I think, alluded to it earlier around how are we going to do this. So standardizing the processes and looking at, as an example, if you have large enterprise systems, how can you extract the data so it's easily made open if the decision is to make that data open in the first place. And then there is a supporting infrastructure now, for this particular initiative, and it requires policy, it requires technology and tools, it requires human and financial resources. Much of that being, potentially just a reallocation of resources as opposed to new resources. And then you actually need the physical data itself. And the final slide that I wanted to provide you with is the approach, which is fairly simple and doesn't deviate much from other types of initiatives. So developing the framework, which we have done, and the document that was provided was an introduction to that framework, and we have a linkage to the open government framework. So we will be starting next month with consultation both internally and externally with stakeholders related to open data, come up with a implementation plan, and then initiate, as Dan had indicated, a pilot project in the new year. And, ongoing dialogue, understanding that the concept of a prototype or a pilot project is that you put it out there to gain experience and to gain feedback from the community. And so there will be ongoing dialogue in this particular initiative. And I believe in the greater context of open government, that needs to be an ongoing dialogue with the citizens and stakeholders of this community. And with that, I'll turn it over, Mr. Chair, for discussion with any councillors that may have some questions.
Thank you. Councillor Urbanovich.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation, Yuri. I know that you've done a lot of work in this field across the country and bring a lot of knowledge to the table for us on this issue. I guess two questions I have. The first one, in terms of the opportunities for community engagement, you talked about the hackathons and so on. Are those an important part of launching something like open data? Because they simply, raise the awareness around it, they generate some excitement around potentially developing some apps and so on. I mean, do you see sort of that kind of approach being fairly consistent with most municipalities that get into this?
Yeah, I would agree. It is fairly consistent that one of the opportunities to kind of gain fairly quick return on your investment about going into an open data initiative is to have one of these events following shortly the actual release of the data. And many of these things are planned in conjunction with the community, so the community, which is a grassroots, will send out the invitation to the community itself in collaboration and in conjunction with the city. So yes, it is quite common.
Okay, and then the second question I have has to really do with the next slide that starts focusing around innovation and economic development opportunities. And I know I don't need to tell you that this area is a bit of a technological hotbed. We have one of the most successful, if not the most successful, startup environments in the country here in Waterloo Region. And so my question is, do you almost see that moving with this and moving with it in a fairly timely manner is really an important logical step in terms of sort of marrying it with our economic development initiatives around growing the startup scene, focusing on this in terms of economic development, and in some ways would probably even give us greater credibility on some of the work that we're already doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I absolutely agree. And when I had earlier noted that there would be both internal and external consultation, one of those organizations that we will be consulting with, looking towards a longer-term collaboration around Kitchener Open Data, is Communitech. And it's an obvious partner in this. And if we look at the overall region, I think there probably needs to be a strategy for Communitech in conjunction with the overall region around technology, because there are huge opportunities here. And sometimes, Communitech may be that enabler that marries organizations or potential startups with the Open Data Initiative happening here.
Great. Thank you very much.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thanks for your presentation. I guess the question that I have is, if you were to compare the City of Kitchener compared to other municipalities with regarding to open data framework, how do we compare throughout Canada with your experience?
So if, and I've lost count of how many municipalities there are in Canada, but it's more than 30. So the reality is that we're still fairly early. We've had some leaders that, like the G4, who started back in 2009, 2010, and then there has been a slow increase. But I can tell you that there are many municipalities in the planning stages and haven't even got to the stage that Kitchener is in. So I would say that you're still in that leadership area, and I think your timing is quite good, because you will benefit from the lessons of others that have gone by.
Okay, great. That's what I'd like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are no other comments at this point. Thank you, Yuri.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have two questions, I believe, that's where we're going right now, that were part of the report as well. And some of these, I think, sort of overlap with some of the questions that were asked before and the comments. So are there any additional comments on question number 4 from Council? I don't. Oh, okay, Councillor Urbanovich.
One quick one on that, and I touched on this earlier, Yuri, in Dan's presentation. But one of the things I've heard in terms of open data and the successful municipalities and those who have maybe not been as well received is this whole notion of engaging the community in terms of identifying those data sets and prioritizing them and so on. And, even, as we look within this area, I mean, I know the region is touted as one that's done a fairly good job of it, some others. So is that generally what your experience has been across the country? That the more successful ones have been the ones that have really sort of been very open and engaging with the open data community?
It's an interesting question, because you actually have a potential catch-22 situation where the government says, what data would you like? And the community says, well, what data do you have? And the government says, well, what data would you like? So it's what we have found, like generally I'm seeing that the GIS data is typically the first data that is made available. And the reason for that is not only that it's of high quality and structured data, but it's location based. And when you take a look at a lot of the uses of GIS data, it has far more potential than other like textual data as an example. I think the other thing that I can tell you quite frankly that is an issue for most organizations moving forward with open data is trying to convince the operating units that they should take the time to make their data available. And there is a little bit of front-end effort that is required in that regard. And that's kind of the stumbling block in most cases, for moving open data quickly and rapidly. Very few organizations are very good at that, and the ones that, when you see a lot of them coming out with the data very quickly, what I have found in those cases, a couple of the cities out west, is that the reason they're getting the data is based on the personal relationships of the corporate lead for that initiative and their personal relationship with the operating units, and or sometimes pressure put on by the community where they're raising the flag that this is the data that we want. It's a combination of things, and quite frankly, there's nothing consistent. We see a fair amount of diversity in how these things are evolving.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to question number 5. Comments or concerns regarding the proposed approach? Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Not a question, just some comments. I didn't actually clearly say that I'm very happy to see where we are here and where we're going. My comment, not really concerned at this point, is that this is some great information, but I think now that we're looking at our customer service strategy, I think that there's a lot of hooks into our customer service strategy going forward with open data that sort of feed each other. When we're looking at efficiency, for example, I think of something like a constituent calling, wondering when grass or brush or that sort of thing is going to get cut because it appears long to them. And then I look at open data and I see that, especially with GIS, it could, in the foreseeable future, I'm not saying anytime soon, but it would be fantastic if there was some sort of Google Maps type interface that covered all of this, this sort of information. So instead of a constituent calling me perhaps and my passing it on or involving my assistant and going to staff to look at a spreadsheet as to when it was serviced last or when it's serviced next, it could take us all entirely out of the equation, and the constituent themselves could go to their tablet or smartphone and see when the parcel was serviced last and when it will be serviced next. And that extends to a lot of parts of customer service. I'm thinking of potholes, for example, there, or snow, which is another huge one. There's a point in the future where people should be able to go online and the roads in their area should be white if they haven't been plowed yet or black if they've been plowed. These are the sort of instant feedback that I think that our constituents, the citizens of Kitchener, are going to look forward to in the foreseeable and distant future. So this is the dry background to all this really, really cool stuff I think we're going to see in the future, and I'm just happy to say that I'd like to say that I'm happy to see where we're going with it.
Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thank you very much. I want to just second that thought about e-service being the wave of the future. The more that we can do for our citizens to enable their own services is really helpful for our own staff. It's cost effective, it's engaging. Speaking of pilots, is there anything we can do for open data towards our budget process in the coming months? That's one question I would have, and perhaps you're not in a position to answer that, so I'll leave that perhaps to staff. The other aspect is the business case that was highlighted here, the economic development aspects that really is a little bit of an introduction into a way of thinking that I hadn't had before. So I would appreciate, I guess, a little bit more background on that. It's a new language. There was a lot of stuff that was very rich, but I would like to unpack that and understand it a little bit more. So that would be helpful, perhaps, to have another slide deck, if that's possible, on that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Back to Dan. We're almost on time.
So I'll wrap up very briefly, and to respond to Councillor Glenn Graham's question, our intention is to deliver on this work program in 2014 within existing resources. When we come forward with our final plan, we'll identify any potential future commitments beyond 2014. So the next slide just talks very briefly about our approach to stakeholder consultation. We plan to undertake it over the next 3 months for 3 reasons. 1, to confirm the framework that you've seen today. 2nd, to identify potential priority actions and to build out that aspect of the framework. And 3rd, to do a deeper dive in open data to understand priorities, look at potential solutions, and receive advice. The consultation will be targeted and focused. We're on the agenda for the Joint Advisory Committee meeting on November the 26th. We plan to add questions into the Environics survey that's going out this fall. We'll use the city website, engage staff stakeholders internally, and as Yuri mentioned, do a deeper dive within the open data community to better understand how to support that action plan. We do envision doing a wider consultation on open government once we have a draft plan back in front of council, and potentially can see that being integrated within the community consultation on the strategic plan in 2014. So in terms of next steps after we've completed the consultation, as I've noted, we'll identify priority actions in addition to our open data launch. We'll update the accountability and transparency policy and bring that back to committee for review. We'll identify a longer-term action plan which will define actions beyond those near-term priorities, and we'll launch our open data portal in the first half of 2014. So that concludes the presentation today. Thank you for your feedback, and I'd be pleased to respond to any final questions.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm just wondering, in the last slide, the people that you're going to be dealing with, and I'm sure it'll probably be included in there someplace, but a number of comments have been made, questions concerning that not everyone will have the access to as much as we would individually, and some members of the public through the net. Will there be, and could there be, some specific information written, distributed at KPL, library, our community centers, and our other facilities, even if it is to posters to remind people of what is happening and then refer them on? Even those who are savvy, technology savvy, can't imagine how they would miss it, but that would trigger for them to go and seek some more information and perhaps add some comments to it. So I just look forward to making sure that there is some paper advertisement, not newspapers I'm talking about, but necessarily within our own facilities.
We can do that, yes.
Councillor Verbanovich.
Yeah, just on that, Mr. Mayor, it may be worthwhile to, particularly because we're sometimes talking about, marginalized communities and those with income challenges and so on. It may be worthwhile as part of that stakeholder consultation to also engage, I'm thinking groups like the Social Planning Council, the Working Center, and so on, and try to get their perspective on what might be relevant for the work that they're doing or the communities that they serve.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
Okay, those are all the comments. Thank you very much to all of you who have participated. It's a new era, it's a new exciting era, and hopefully great engagement with the public. We're going to move to the second item, and that is the Corporate Asset Management Program update. And Hans Gross is going to begin this presentation. Just so we're aware that we do have a caucus meeting scheduled for 5 o'clock, individuals coming in for that time, so I would encourage us to be complete with all our questions by then. Okay. Hans?
Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor Zaire, members of council. Today's presentation provides high-level results for detailed asset management plans completed for pavement, sanitary, water, stormwater utilities, and the auditorium and the arenas. I'd like to acknowledge Angela Mick, Nick Gollin, and Greg McTaggart, who are here, that helped put those plans together. The challenge really was in distilling more than 400 pages of technical notes into less than 40 slides. The importance of asset management, I won't repeat. It was included on page 1 of my report in bullet form, and I'd ask that through the presentation, if you could consider the 3 questions that are on page 2 of my report, and that is the information that you're hearing clear and helpful? Are the funding scenarios reasonable, together with the establishment of reserves? Is there any other high-level information that you would like to receive in future updates? In terms of the agenda, It's a little bit of information about the Asset Management Division, a bit of history, one step at a time, how we got here, how Kitchener measures up relative to asset management, funding source for the 12 asset groups, the asset plan results for the 5 areas. Cynthia Fletcher will present the facilities management overview and the Odd and Arena results. I will then bring it back to the roadmap for the next steps to finish off. Purpose of Asset Management Division. I chose to hand out with the report hard copies of the presentation simply because there's so much information on them. Give you a chance to review it, and also some of the graphs are very detailed. So I'm not going to go over everything or read everything on the slides. I'm assuming that that's already been done. So the purpose is to develop the program to make sure that we can sustain our assets. Up until May of this year, I was the only person involved in doing asset management. In May, through an internal reorganization, the Engineering's Asset Planning Group was assigned to Asset Management Division. And we provide services both corporate and asset-specific for the division, for the corporation. The history, one step at a time. Some of this information you've seen before in terms of the PSAB, which is the Public Sector Service Board, which required municipalities to report on capital assets in the financial statements. 2007 was a high-level assessment. 2007 to 9 were the implementation of CityWorks and SAP. 2009 was another asset management delivery strategy. 2011, if you recall, was the gap analysis report, which was presented, and that provided improvement projects and rated the 12 asset groups. 2012, Kitchener adopted the asset management policy, and that policy speaks to affordable services, dependable services, planned maintenance, and prioritized funding. In 2012 and 13, we completed the pilot projects for pavement and Odd and Arenas. And this year, we also completed detailed asset management plans for the 3 utilities, sanitary, water, and storm, so that we are in compliance with provincial requirements in the event that funding becomes available. How does Kitchener measure up? The gap analysis results indicated that Kitchener is in the middle. It's not the best, not the worst in terms of its practices. There are, among the 12 groups, some that are at the high end, fleet, doing very, very well in most areas. At the low end are cemeteries, golfing parks, and primarily due to condition information, data regarding inventory, data regarding condition of that inventory, costing. So there was a whole range of areas in which they were scored, and we have a range in which they resulted. In 2012, I carried out a telephone survey of 18 Ontario mid to large size cities. We ended up in about the top 20% in terms of asset management practices. In July of this year, I participated in a research paper through University of Western Ontario that examined the asset management activities of 20 Ontario cities, and we again were in the top 20%. And the completion of the detailed asset management plans have now put us in compliance with provincial guidelines for funding purposes. The purpose of this graph is simply to show that 6 of the asset groups are funded through user fees and 6 are funded from the tax rate. The slide shows on the left side the 12 asset groups. The numbers without the brackets are replacement values of those asset groups, and that's based on PSAB numbers brought forward to December 2011. In brackets, you'll see other numbers, higher numbers. Those are the replacement values based on the detailed asset management plans that we have now completed. So we've completed them for water, for sanitary, for stormwater, and you can see that there's a huge increase in value, in asset value, because we have completed those detailed plans. We've also done partial plans for facilities, one being the Odd. It has over 150 buildings, and we've also done the pavement under roads and traffic, and included in that are bridges and sidewalks, curbs, various other surface utilities. The total value based on the PSAB is about $2.7 billion. If we add the information that we currently have, it puts us in the order of $4.5 billion. And it's likely that when we do all of the asset group updates, the city's assets are likely to reach about $7 billion in total. In terms of what is the industry standard for annual funding for assets, it's 1 to 2% of replacement value. The purpose of this slide is to give you an idea of the level of confidence in the results that we've produced. We used the city's REVA modeling program to develop the plans and the financial projections. The level of confidence is the indicator for considering the results in light of the quantity and quality of data and the information used as input to the model. And the level of confidence is influenced by the 4 factors that are shown on this slide. And O&M means operating and maintenance. It was just too long to put on the slide. The third and the fourth bullet is where information from the operations division and the operations review comes into play. Asset management results for pavement. Essentially, this is the roads with a replacement value of $416 million. It's interesting to note that 70% of our roads are local and 30% are collector. The condition is measured by PQI, and PQI measures roads in terms of roughness, surface distress, and deflections. Based on 2012 last inspection, the current overall PQI is 68, which is rated as fair. Local roads are at 60, collectors are at 80, which means we've spent more money on collectors than we have on locals. When you get a PQI of 50, that's a candidate for resurfacing and reconstruction, and once you get to 25, that's only reconstruction. Confidence level on this information is 90% because we have a lot of good data. Our target is a level of service of 70, which is similar to the other municipalities in the region. And we do an inspection cycle every 2 years. This gives you an indication of the types of pavements and how they are rated from a visual perspective. And again, overall PQI is 68, local roads are 60, and collector roads are 80. So 80 puts you in the green, 60 puts you in the yellow. The current deficit of pavement, and deficit means work that should be done now, is $170 million. And that includes a significant amount of reconstruction. The current funding is $6.2 million annually. If we maintained the current funding level, we would not sustain our pavement structure throughout the whole city. We would reach a PQI of 50 by the year 2040. I've shown 3 alternative funding scenarios. Each one of those 3 will sustain pavement over the longer term. One is to fund at 12 million, another at 6.2 and increasing 2.2% annually, and the third starting at 8 and increasing at 1.5% annually. Just for your information, to do a full depth construction once the PQI reaches 25 or 30, the cost there is $845 per meter of road, or $845,000 per kilometer. To do just the asphalt reconstruction is $390 per meter of road. And to do what you call a shave and pave, a mill overlay, is about $285 per meter. So there's a significant difference in having to reconstruct the entire pavement structure, which is asphalt and gravel. This is intended to show you what happens through the various funding scenarios. The graph, the horizontal of the bottom axis shows a 60-year time frame, and this is one of the reasons that I handed out the papers in hard copy, because it's kind of difficult to see here. The left side shows expenditures in 2013 dollars. The right axis shows pavement condition rating. The blue and red vertical lines show the value of the work to be done, where blue is rehabilitation and red is replacement. The lower horizontal lines are the funding scenarios. The upper horizontal lines reflect the resulting pavement condition. And if you look at the blue line or the brown line coming down, that's the if we maintain the current funding level, that's what happens to our pavement structure over the years. The funding levels that are being recommended are in the order of 1.5 to 1.9% of asset replacement value, so it's within the industry standard. In summary, for pavement, there can be numerous funding scenarios depending on the starting level, budget increases, and pavement service level. So if you want to reduce the pavement service level, that can be done as well. The city's ability to provide funding, as well as the ability to manage increased projects, is also to be considered. But it is clear that the current funding level will not sustain the current target of 70. Sanitary utility asset plan results. This is divided up into 2 parts, one being pipes, the other being 22 pumping stations. Each one has their own value. Condition in general is good to very good. Confidence levels about 75% based on the data that we have for the various areas. And the service level is for sewers, we don't publish it. There is a regulatory for pumping stations. By our operations folks, complaints are prioritized, immediate response is given to critical events, and customer expectations is an event-free sewer system. Now, the pipes, as I said, are generally in good condition. The pumping stations are also in good condition through regular assessments by an outside provider. And we do need improvements on documenting condition and developing and implementing operating and maintenance strategies and determining life cycle costs. This shows the number of pipes installed in 10-year intervals. So the horizontal on the bottom gives you a time axis from 1920 to 1913. The left vertical gives you the number of pipes installed in meters, and the right side gives you the average age of pipes, which at this point is about 32 years of age. One of the important dates in the life of the sanitary system is January the 1st, 1980. At that time, up until that time, house foundation drains to the sanitary sewer system was a common and acceptable practice. 52% of our current inventory was installed by 1980. That translates into about 45,000 homes. This accounts for a great deal of the clear water that's being directed to the region's wastewater treatment plant. It's very difficult and very expensive to remove the water generated through this from the sanitary system. Under the funding strategy, the current funding level averages $7.5 million annually, and we project that by 2023 there will be a $15 million deficit under current funding, which is manageable. So the strategy is to maintain the current funding level for the next 10 years, and after 2023, adjust the annual funding either to 8.4 or to 6 million, increased 1%. The result of that would have a deficit cleared and a reserve established between 2023 and 2050 to fund the anticipated spike in activities after 2050. Now, the major assumption for the funding strategy is that there will be a trend toward lining the sewer instead of replacing the sewer. Lining the sewer will add about 40 more years of life and costs about 1/3 the price of replacing a sewer. Just for information, a replacement cost is $1,100 per meter, whereas a lining is between $350 to $470 per meter. Now, if the strategy is not successful, then the deficit's going to grow. And the funding levels that we're suggesting are about 1% of asset replacement value. This graph illustrates the impact on pipe conditions from the funding scenarios, and again, as with the pavement, we have the value of expenditure on the left. We have a time graph in 75 years on the bottom. We have the condition on the right vertical axis from 0 to 100. The lower blue and purple horizontal lines are the two funding strategies, and the upper horizontal lines are the resulting pipe conditions. So you can see that the two scenarios result in pretty similar pipe condition results. The green and the red vertical are the work that needs to be done. So in essence, from 2014 to 2023, we do the work as defined in the current capital budget, and between 2023 and 2050, we implement the pipelining strategy, we clear up the deficit, and we establish a reserve for the upcoming spike in work. Pumping stations, the strategy there is a continuation of the current treatment. There is no deficit. We maintain the funding level in the 10-year capital forecast, and after 10 years, the expenditures projected to be in a range of $750,000 a year. Most activities are replacement, and there are regular updates to the pumping station assessment. In summary, the sanitary pipes seem to be reasonably funded to sustain the infrastructure. The key to making it work is the adoption and development of the relining strategy to be done on a 60-40 split. And again, if that's not successful, then we will be building up a deficit again. The projected funding also includes establishment of a reserve after 2023 to avoid drastic increases for the peaks starting in 2065. And there is an ongoing condition monitoring cycle on a 12-year cycle basis, which can, in the future, adjust forecast time frame and funding requirements depending on the condition of the pipe. In terms of the pumping stations, they're well maintained, and that's because of the high risk and the high consequence of their failure. A recent example is in the city of Waterloo. The funding level is established through a pumping station assessment program, which is done in 8-year cycles. Water utility results. The water utility is in 2 subparts, the pipes, hydrants, valves, and then the second part being the water meters. The condition is fair to very good. There's a big variation. Confidence levels about 75% for water mains and 90% for water meters, simply because the water meters are a mechanical device that can be readily evaluated. The water meters are in below average condition. Their life cycle is about 18 years. And the reason that water meters are important and need to be kept in good shape is because they're the basis for the generation of revenue, not only for water, but also for the sewer utility. While the inventory data is good to very good, the condition data and determining life cycle costing needs improvement. This is a very similar graph to the sewer. It simply shows the time during which pipes were installed, the average age of the water pipes being 38 years. About 15% of the system was installed before 1960. Funding strategy for water mains. Current funding levels about 6.2 annually. At that level, by 2023, we'll have a deficit of about $63 million. The strategy is to maintain the current funding level for the 10-year capital plan. We address the deficit between 2025 and 45. The strategies are annual funding of $7 million, or starting at $5 million and increasing at 1% annually. The result being a clear deficit, a reserve established to fund the anticipated spike. And again, the strategy is based on relining of water main on a 60-40 split instead of having to replace it. Replacement cost is about $1,000 per lineal meter. Lining is about $600 per lineal meter. And the funding levels that are being recommended are approximately 1% of asset replacement value. This is a graph, again, showing the results of the funding scenarios, where you have the 75 years at the bottom, dollar values on the left side, pipe condition on the right. The funding scenarios horizontally at the bottom and the pipe condition resulting horizontally at the top. Both scenarios give reasonable results and sustain the infrastructure in the long term. Under water meters, we have a current funding level of $0.41 million a year. Current deficit is $1.8 million. We need to start funding that at $760,000 per year plus inflation, and a water meter inventory system is being investigated to improve the data related to the replacement cycles. So, summary comments for the water utility. Water pipes are reasonably funded. However, again, we need to implement the relining strategy that I talked about. There is a significant deficit, but we can make that work by starting to address it in 2023 and collecting money in a reserve. The reserve is going to be a very important feature in all of these plans. The ongoing monitoring of pipe breaks and pipe condition, again, will adjust the time frame. One of the things that we can't do with water mains is it's difficult to put a camera inside to see what condition the pipe is in. It's a pressurized system. So therefore, we have to count on pipe breaks to determine the condition of the pipe, as well as knowing the various materials that it's made of and their susceptibility to breaking. The current funding for water meters is significantly below what's required to adhere to the prescribed replacement cycle. And again, the consequence of not replacing water meters within the cycle is an impact on revenue for both water and sanitary utilities. Stormwater utility. There are 4 parts to the stormwater utility. pipes, manholes, catch basins, oil and grit separators, OGS, storm facilities or storm water ponds, and streams and creeks. The fourth one, we have very little information on. That's a work in progress that needs to be done. The confidence level is about 70% on pipes and 60% on facilities due to various data information. The condition data for storm pipes, we only have condition data on about 10% of our current inventory. We just started this. So that it's going to take some accelerated work to determine the condition of our storm pipes, and that may well change the picture down the road as we get better information. Condition of the information on swim ponds is reasonable. However, the operating and maintenance for the swim ponds needs improvement to give us better dollar values for that work. The utility is underfunded at this point. Again, from installation point of view, this is the same picture pretty much as the storm and sanitary and water. Some of the other information that isn't on the graph is that the OGS, or the oil and grit separators, installation of those started around the 1990s. We've got about 50 in place and quite a few more to put in. Stormwater ponds, that started in the mid-60s, and we have about 125 installed to date. Under the funding strategy, the current funding level averages $4 million annually. There will be a deficit at that level by 2023 of $24 million. The strategy is to maintain current funding for the next 10 years, and then there are two strategies after 2023 to deal with the deficit and to deal with the reserve. While some relining of pipes may take place, the strategy here primarily is replacement, simply because relining large pipes is not feasible. It just doesn't work very well. And the replacement cost at this point for storm pipe is about $1,000 per meter. We will need to accelerate the condition inspection program. As I said, only 10% of our system has condition information, and we will need to increase the funding level down the road. The funding levels that we're suggesting are about 1.4% of asset replacement value. This again shows the results of the two funding strategies, with the funding strategies being the horizontal lines on the bottom and the resulting pipe condition horizontally on top. Stormwater ponds. The facilities will be retrofit. There will be retrofitting of facilities from 2014 to 2023. Currently, we have a funding level of $1.5 million. There will be a deficit after 10 years, and again, we're recommending maintaining the current funding level, and after the 10-year period, it's projected to be in the range of 1.6 annually, with the two optional strategies that are shown. And again, this graph shows the results of the SWIM facilities on the funding strategies, where the funding strategies are the horizontal lines at the bottom. The resulting condition of the SWIM facilities are the dashed lines horizontally at the top, and the red line at the top is the ideal condition. For oil and grit separators, we have a funding level of about $360,000 annually. There will be a deficit, a slight deficit after 10 years. Again, the strategy is to maintain the current funding level, and after the 10 years, it would be in the range of 0.22. OGS replacements are due in the 2070s. They're essentially a large structure underground that separate oil and grit from water to give water quality. The OGS units also become installed as road reconstruction occurs. We have specific locations for them, and as we do road reconstruction, they get put in place. Summary comments for the stormwater utility. Again, the condition of the pipes is not well known. We only have 10% of the inventory assessed. We will require a higher level of funding for them. The strategy does rely on pipe replacement and not relining. And there will be an accelerated condition assessment to help us adjust the forecast framework and the funding conditions. SWIM facilities will require an increased level of funding to function as intended, and the ongoing annual audit for stormwater facilities will assist in improving the time frame and the funding requirements. Oil and grit separators are usually installed in specific locations as road reconstruction occurs, and their funding and timelines can be tied to those schedules. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia now to provide you with the results of the auditorium and the arenas.
Good afternoon, Mayor Zare, members of council, colleagues. I'm pleased to present the asset management plan results for one of the city's major facilities. As stewards of the facility assets for the City of Kitchener, the Facilities Management Division has developed objectives which align with the corporate asset management objectives, and we've also outlined activities that the division performs in developing and managing the asset portfolio. You can see from the 3.3 million square feet of gross floor area that the city owns a vast portfolio of buildings, and just for reference, that square footage would cover about 61 soccer fields or 194 hockey arenas, just to put it in perspective. When we talk about facilities and we refer to level of service, we refer to it in a facility condition index. And that index is calculated by taking the value of the work deficit now and for the next 5 years and dividing it by the replacement value for that asset. In the industry, we are always shooting for an FCI target of 0.1, which translates into no more than 10% of the asset's value in work deficit or investment required. When we look at the example of the auditorium, we took the main complex and we used it for our example, and that included the Dom Cardillo Arena, the Administrative Corridor, and the Twin Pad Arenas. The average FCI, or Facility Condition Index, for the auditorium was 0.2, or translated into about $10.5 million worth of investment required at this point. We then looked at two different funding scenarios for the auditorium. One was using the 2013 level of funding, which was approximately $990,000, escalated by 2% over annually over a 60-year period. And the second one was based on a 2012 funding level of approximately $440,000 plus the 2% annual escalator. When we looked at those scenarios using this graph, the blue line indicates the budget, the green line indicates the annual cost, and the red area indicates the backlog deficit or the investment required. So when we looked at this scenario, the works deficit in red is manageable over the short to mid-term, but then grows rapidly about 2040 and beyond. If we look at that in comparison to the Facility Condition Index target, we can sustain an ability to remain close to that target of 0.1, which is indicated by the red line, and that's achievable in the short to mid-term. The blue line is what we anticipate the FCI to be. Comparatively, if we looked at the funding level of $440,000 per year, you can see a rapidly growing deficit for the facility, and that's indicated in red. And again, comparing that to our industry standard FCI target of 0.1, where almost immediately there is an inability to even remain close to that target. The type of data and information that we've presented before you today will assist staff in making better data-driven recommendations to council in the future, and therefore assist council in making some data-driven investment decisions moving forward. I'd like to point out, though, that facility condition is only one of the factors that we would take into consideration when we're prioritizing work or making decisions related to our facilities. The other major one being the facility's ability to support its intended use, either now or into the future. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mr. Gross.
Roadmap for the next steps. These are the activities in order of priority, and these will apply to all asset groups. The 7 major steps form the basis of the roadmap. The roadmap is intended to develop policies, standards, procedures, and templates that are going to set the tone for the 12 asset groups in developing all of their detailed asset plans. And in addition to that, budget and reserve forecasts for all asset groups will need to be developed to form a comprehensive financial planning strategy. I'm not going to go into detail on each one. Each one has a fairly extensive explanation, but be that as it may, they are listed at this point. The roadmap, the timing roadmap is suggested again for the 12 asset groups for implementation. This is a start. It will probably be adjusted, but it's our best outline at this point. And this is the final slide. It's a self-explanatory rule of asset management. Asset management is all about service delivery, and the assets exist really only to provide a service to customers. And the real balancing act is between customer expectations, sustainable and affordable cost, level of service, and business risk. And that's the key to supporting the foundation of our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans and Cynthia. I've used that quote on the screen right now a number of times, and it usually catches people and they fully understand what the issue is when you put it in those words. Difficulty with today's presentation, I'll see if I can say it with a straight face, there wasn't enough information. That is obviously a lot of information, and figures and certainly the charts graphically give us a great deal to look at and give us the sense of what task we have in front of us, so it's not insignificant. Okay, we have 2 questions, comments right now. Councillor Ioannidis.
Through you, Mayor Zaire. Thanks for your very, very detailed presentation, Hans. It's rather eye-opening, to say the least. We've always been told, even through FCM, about current infrastructure deficit throughout Canada and other municipalities, but this really hits home on how significant it is even in our community. And I guess the question is obvious to me: is how are we going to do this? Like it seems like it's a mountain that we can't climb.
In my view, it's very manageable. In most cases, we can continue with our 10-year capital program, but what we have to do is we have to investigate and put into play the alternative strategies that cost less money so that we can do more work. And that's the one thing that we'll need to investigate over these next 10 years, is to make sure that the strategy we've talked about in relining the sanitary sewers and the water mains is in fact something that is going to work. We know that it does work to a certain degree. We are doing some of it right now. But again, it's going to become the thrust of our strategy and money-saving technique to make our dollars go further. And again, over the next 10 years, I believe that if we maintain and sustain the capital forecasting and implement it as we have intended, then we should be on the road to being able to manage it, both a deficit as well as the upcoming work. The key will be to establish and maintain reserves. Those are going to be key in going forward. So I have no doubt that it can be done, that it's manageable, but we're going to have to plan it out and we're going to have to stick to it.
I agree with you that we need to plan, and that's what this is here today for, which is I can definitely appreciate. My concern is it seems like we have a funding model for the next 10 years, but after that we just have this mountain that we're going to need to climb. And I know you'd mentioned reserves in your answer, and so when we're talking about reserves, are we looking at possibly as a council to even increase taxes further just to support this?
No, the funding models talk about incremental increases in expenditure. The fact is that all of the money that we're projecting to be spent wouldn't be spent. Some of it would be put aside into a reserve fund.
Okay, that's good to hear. My last question deals with, it's on your one slide, it says, how does Kitchener measure up? And one of your point 4, which is in the early portions of your presentation, says Kitchener's completion of a detailed asset management plan is in compliance with the provincial guidelines for funding purposes. So before we weren't in compliance?
The provincial government came out in September of last year, September 2012, and stated that if municipalities wanted to receive funding through funding programs from either the federal government or the provincial government, there needed to be completed asset management plans in place for those projects. So up until now, we were not in compliance. We've completed them now. We are now in compliance.
Okay, so that to me seems rather important. So I guess it seems like a lot of the planning and initiatives that we did in the early 70s and has kind of put us in this predicament of replacing our infrastructure, and it's kind of good that we're looking at towards being more efficient in looking at intensification rather than growing out, because obviously this is a good example of why urban sprawl is not going to work. Thank you.
Thanks. Just before we go on to further elaborate on the question that Councillor Ioannidis asked about the lining, your comments on that. What does the lining do to capacity? If we suddenly line all of our water mains and all of our sewers, I don't understand the technology enough to understand what that does to capacity.
In short, what lining is, it's a thin plastic membrane that is pulled inside the sanitary sewer and then either through air pressure or heat expanded to stick to the inside of the pipe. And it's very, very thin. It's like a thick plastic membrane. It does not reduce capacity. In fact, in some cases, it can increase capacity because it makes the pipe more slippery.
All right, thank you. Councillor Davey.
Thank you, and I think we're okay for time, so just one more technical question if I could. You were talking about road reconstruction versus resurfacing, and when it gets below a certain point, resurfacing is no longer an option. Does that continue in perpetuity? So basically we should never ever let a road get to the point where reconstruction is required?
We can get to the point where reconstruction is required when we have to replace the sanitary and the water main and the storm on the road, because that entails digging up the entire road right-of-way, and that entails digging up the entire pavement structure. That happens perhaps every 90 years. So for a 90-year period, what we want to do is we want to extend the life of the pavement through good practice. And what happens is the pavement structures, I'm going to get a little bit off track. The pavement structure is made up of gravel and asphalt. The asphalt's a riding surface, provides some strength. The gravel is the main strength for that structure. The gravel has to be free draining to make sure that no water gets caught up, because when water freezes, it expands, and that's why you see asphalt cracking in the wintertime. The other key there is to make sure that when gravel gets wet through water draining into cracks on the asphalt, if the ground below the gravel is a silt or a clay, you get a pumping action. If you've ever taken clay and held it in your hand and vibrated it, you'll see water coming up. The same thing can happen with a silt subgrade. With the constant pounding action, the silt and the clay will find its way into the gravel. That gravel becomes frost susceptible, and then your road is toast.
Okay. And just trying to wrap my head around some of the earlier numbers, I believe earlier in your presentation you said when you're completed this, you're estimating that the city's assets will be around $7 billion?
That's my guesstimate at this point. Right now, with the work we've done, we're at about 4.5.
Okay. And you also mentioned that typically in setting up budgeting for assets of this type, it's 1% to 2%. So that number is right there, then $170 to $140 million we're looking at.
Correct.
Do you have an idea of where we are right now? Like, I'd just like to look at the absolute overarching view. Do you have an idea of what we're budgeting now?
The total capital forecast right now is just under, averages about $90 million. However, some of that is development charge new construction, which you can't really take into consideration. I think we're probably at the $60 million mark.
Around 60. Ballpark's fine, just so I'm aware. And lastly, to follow up on Councillor Ioannidis' question regarding tax implications then. So we won't see anything related to the operating budget for this in the next couple of years at least, it seems.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Yunetsky.
Thank you. I appreciate the report. Very, very detailed, very informative, and something I guess we needed for a long time. I do have a number of questions. A couple of them are technical. The life of piping, water, sewer, and sanitary. Pipes that were installed back 100 years ago, what's the longevity, and I know we're replacing them, versus the pipes that are being manufactured today, and what's their projected longevity? Could you compare the two timeframes?
The pipes that were installed initially were vitrified clay. They last a long time, and let me start my comments by saying this. Any pipe, the longevity of any pipe is subject to its installation. Installation is everything. If you install a poor pipe properly, that poor pipe will last a long time unless the material it's made of wears out. So having said that, vitrified clay was used first. It's a very brittle pipe. It had joints that leaked like a sieve. We've replaced most of that stuff. Then came asbestos cement pipe and concrete pipe together. Concrete pipe was quite good. The joints were not so good. It tended to erode when it encountered effluent such as from J.M. Schneider. The bottom half of a concrete pipe was eaten out by effluent from J.M. Schneider. The asbestos cement pipe was very inert. Nothing really attacked it. However, it was very partial to splitting, to cracking, to breaking at the slightest move. Then came plastic, PVC pipe, which is a very good pipe and which is being used today. So longevity is a matter of installation and also how sensitive the pipe is to various things. Plastic pipe is very good in terms of its longevity. It's not attacked by many chemicals at all. What does happen to it, though, is it can get squashed if there's too much weight on it or if it's not installed properly. Installation is the key to everything. And if the pipe we put in today is installed properly, the plastic pipe, it could last well over 100 years.
Okay, thank you. That's a good education lesson there. I guess the costs that was mentioned in terms of budget for upcoming next year, whatever, if we sustain where we are now, there will be no impact on the potential taxpayer next year as you would see it in terms of your presentation?
That's
subsequent years we'd have to sort of move forward?
That's the intent, yes.
Okay. So staff have in the previous, so going on that statement of the budget, last year and previous years, different divisions of the engineering department, putting in those terms, have indicated in their presentation that we are falling behind. We have an accelerated program. Those terms were used to try to keep up to where we are. Yet your presentation here today presents a sort of sustainable picture versus what I've heard in the past. Could you comment on those two?
Yes, the sustainability is long-term. What staff are talking about is the buildup of deficit. And we do have deficit in sanitary, in storm, in water. Deficit is work that should have been done that has not been done.
And are you, by extension, saying that still exists?
That still exists.
So we have to correct that and try to bring that...
That correction will take place if we maintain our current 10-year capital program. We'll be moving forward with a deficit. We won't be attacking that deficit. The deficit will be addressed after 2023 when we start the alternate funding program and the alternate construction, reconstruction methodology, the strategy.
Okay, I see your point there. That was made out in your presentation, so I appreciate that. The comments on the, using the example of the auditorium and the twin pads in terms of its status and replacement needs, the auditorium was built 60 years ago, if not more, 50, 65 years ago, whatever the date was, whereby the twin pads were only built about 25, 30 years ago. So you've got two different levels of age of two components of that complex, yet you seem to have lumped them together. Is there really a difference when you look at the odd as it's itself versus the twin pads by themselves?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Unesky is absolutely right. I mean, we have taken the data for the entire complex and sort of amalgamated it together. One of the things we'll be able to do moving forward is take portions of a building and maybe analyze that separately. The other thing that we would be able to do is not just roll up to a building level, but we might be able to slice across all of our buildings at a major component level. So you are correct. If we were to separate out and look at those two areas individually, they might have different facility condition indices.
Because I remember last year, I think during budget time, it was presented by some staff person on the auditorium that, geez, we're getting to a stage we're going to have to replace the air conditioning system or the boiler system or whatever, because it's at that stage that eventually needs it. Yet, I thought the twin pad area is still relatively good, subject to whatever attention it needs to. So I got the odd being, a serious concern in terms of how much do we replace it, how much money do we still spend into it to keep it functional and going. So you basically answered my question, so that's more of a comment than a question.
Excuse me, just to add something to that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Cynthia, we actually did some of those major changes with HVAC as part of the upgrades, the expansion, because that was a part of the opportunity to add it into the contract at that point last year, correct?
You are correct, Mayor Zer. Those improvements are indicated in one of the slides.
Right, they are.
Now, that was on the Dom Cardillo side
Correct.
of the facility as part of the expansion.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Nestor?
Okay, and the final question pertains to the work that you've done, Mr. Gross. You indicated that you were working by yourself for a 3-year period, and in the last, I guess, half dozen months or so, you had 6 staff helping. Is this sort of like borrowed staff? You said there was a reorganization. I just didn't quite understand what you were getting at there. Are they now in your section now, or from another, or help me out?
They are now in the Asset Management Division, yes.
And they came from all engineering or different aspects?
They came from engineering as a unit. They were called the Asset Planning Unit. And essentially the work they did was very much related to what I do in asset management. So therefore it made sense that they would come into the Asset Management Division. There is still work that is being done for engineering by them in various areas. However, it all relates to the management of whether it's pavement, sanitary, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Vrbanovich.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. 3 quick questions. One of them has been partially touched on, I think. But the first one, Hans, as you did this and looked at all of our pipes and sewers and so on and the replacement of them, I presume you looked at it in the context of the replacement of existing sewer pipe and the costs associated with that. I'm wondering how much we've taken into account climate change mitigation as part of this, because we know that there's been a substantive body of work that's been done that really means we're going to need to start going with bigger sewers, and we're going to see more of the 20 and 50 and 100-year storms and all those kinds of things. How much was that factored into your calculations?
The change in atmosphere essentially impacts the stormwater system. This assessment did not take that into account.
So that means that's a body of work that we probably need to do yet then going forward, because we're going to have to factor that in.
That's correct, and it may or may not be a replacement of pipe. It may be acceptance of certain streets that get flooded occasionally. It may be acceptance of a higher level of water flow down a street when you have overland flow. It may be the establishment of additional stormwater catchment areas. There are different ways of addressing that, and it may not necessarily be through pipe expansion.
Okay, no, fair enough. But it's good to know that it's a piece of work that we need to do yet, because it is something that I think is certainly going to be a challenge for not just us, but municipalities across the country. Second is a similar type of question, but more focused around the whole notion of intensification. And we obviously know that making better use of existing infrastructure is the more cost-effective way to go. But at the same time, as we intensify through the central corridor and the growth areas around the future LRT stations and so on, that's going to be putting some pressures on the infrastructure in those areas as well. Have we factored any of that into it, or again, have we largely looked at it in the context of existing usage patterns?
This has been looked at in terms of the condition and primarily the condition and the risk of the infrastructure and its life cycle. It has not taken into account the increase in flow, if you will. If you look at the sanitary sewer system, intensification, yes, it will increase the flow, but I would say that most of our sanitary systems have adequate capacity to handle the amount of intensification that will take place. In terms of the stormwater system, there will be some additional areas paved, some additional roofs. That may impact the storm system more than the sanitary, and it's a matter to determine on individual basis to what degree. From a water main perspective, we are, I believe, engaging the region in developing a master water main pressure gradient map to determine what impacts intensification have on various water mains. So there may be water mains that need to be increased in size or twinned, as the case may be, to bring that into play.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question, and it's been partially touched on just in terms of the audit and the renovations and so on, but I guess as we go forward, whether we're talking the audit or whether we're talking other arenas or whatever, at some point, I presume that one of the factors that will need to be looked into is not just necessarily the maintenance of existing buildings, but at some point do you potentially replace existing buildings? And I mean, it's something that's been openly talked about when the last expansion happened, that that'll probably carry us another 20 years, maybe a little longer, but at some point that's going to have to be a topic of conversation.
All right, through the mayor. That is one of the differences with something like the facility assets, is you will make decisions to repair, to replace, rehabilitate. We may repurpose a building. We may actually make investments so that we can leverage a sale. But all of this data is intended to help council make those investment decisions. So whether it's the amount of money or the timing of the investment, we'll have to take all of that into consideration.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you to everyone that was involved in putting this together. It's an incredibly comprehensive piece of work. So thank you.
Councillor Glenn Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Hans, I appreciate the overview. It was excellent, very detailed. I'd like to talk about confidence level in two areas: pipe installation and there was a recent example of sod replacement that we had to go back and redo, and we have deep trust in our contractors, but I was disappointed about the lack of quality in that instance. Do we oversee pipe installation to ensure high quality is maintained? Do we have oversight there?
I believe I can answer for the Director of Engineering to say that the installation of pipes is supervised either by our staff directly or by consultants on our behalf.
Okay, that's good to hear. And in terms of confidence level on the relining strategy, could you ballpark where you are in terms of that strategy being successful, because we're putting a lot of eggs in that basket?
We have a relining program that is currently ongoing. It's not a huge program. We've completed about 1 kilometer of it in this past year, and there is a regular program annually, but we'll have to increase that to determine how effective it is and whether it works in many instances. That's for the sanitary sewer. The water main lining Angela, I think we've done some, but not a whole lot. So that's another area that we need to get further practice on and further experience. And that's why the 10-year window, if you will, to maintain our current program while we are investigating, while we are making sure that what our strategy, what we would like to implement, is implementable.
And I'm sure you'll bring back an update every term of council. And I think that will be helpful to have that check-in on how it's successful or not. In terms of new technology, I think that's always a really interesting thing. And the opportunity about different kinds of pavement, permeable pavers or longer lasting pavers, are we looking at those, or are they on the radar at all in terms of the cost and the benefit to the city?
My comment on permeability is anything that will let water into the subgrade of a road is not good. Because what it does is it saturates the gravel, and that will cause heaving and breaking and premature aging of that pavement structure. It's okay for areas that have great drainage below, but Kitchener is not that fortunate in being constructed on all gravel. We have the glaciers were good to us. They gave us a huge variety of soils to play with.
So please forgive my ignorance, but I probably misspoke when I said permeable. I've seen examples in trade magazines that come to council about different kinds of pavement that is longer lasting, using different materials. Has that been looked at?
I believe that the main players would be asphalt, concrete, or the precast pavers. Those are primarily the three areas. It comes down to the installation cost and the replacement cost and access for maintenance. This is a story that goes back probably about 40 years when the concrete companies were making a play for doing more work, for paving more roads using concrete. And there was an assessment done at the time, and even from an initial installation point of view, concrete was more money. It is today even. And when you try to go back and repair things in the road, it's very difficult to do so. So yes, there is ongoing review of this, but no, nothing has changed in terms of the preferred methodology.
Thanks, and I'll leave it at that. I just want to make sure we're always looking at new technologies, and maybe there'll be a day we can put liners in the larger pipes if technology changes. So thank you for your presentation.
Councillor Gazzola.
When I read this document on the weekend, I was confused because it's pretty complex. It really looked like to me a picture of doom and gloom to where we're going down the road. But now I'm really confused. You're telling me that if we stay the course with our 10-year capital forecast that we have in place now, there's not going to be any real abnormal impact to our taxpayers. Did I understand correctly?
There's one area, water meters. We need to improve the water meters, but in general, that's the correct assumption. Yes, the interpretation.
In your projections, I looked out long past when I probably will be here. The figures look so alarming. You talk about lining and replacement. In your projections, well, it's the whole question of technology. In your projections, you're going out 75 years. What are you using? Are you using the concept of liners or replacements? Are you taking into account any impact of tremendous improvements in technology? Are those taken into account?
At this point, the only strategy that has been used to project long-term is the 60-40 split between relining and reconstruction. That's the basic assumption that we've been able to carry forward, because it's very difficult to project what other initiatives might do to improve the situation.
Okay, I accept that. So, you know, on the one hand, we have the downside that we don't know our weather patterns have changed, but also down the road our technology is going to change considerably too.
Yes.
So the two factors come into play. I'm really pleased to hear that if we stay the course, things are good. Just on that, on the auditorium, we're talking about, we're putting almost $1 million a year in there, I understand. We've almost doubled it for the next few years?
Through you, Mayor Zare. No, those were just two examples of 2 years funding. If I look over the 10-year capital forecast, we average approximately $560,000 for the auditorium.
All right, so that's fine. So the figure's 560, but you say we have a deficit right now of $10.5 million. So how can we live with the two? The 560 is ongoing. And you have to clean up the $10.5 million.
That is correct.
So how do you do that and not have any impact?
What we will be looking at is in the building area, we do a risk analysis as well, looking at probability of failure and consequence of failure of certain components, and we'll have to make decisions and prioritize and make recommendations. And we may reach a point where we do have to come to council and make a recommendation to increase the funding.
Can is it fair of me to expect that the 10.5 is a rather conservative figure? I mean conservative, overly conservative.
Through the chair, if you're asking me if it's a worst case scenario, I would say yes.
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 I applaud you for your honesty. Just going back, we go back one schedule. Can you go back one? I don't understand. What does that mean exactly?
That means that the work that needs to be done to develop the individual asset groups so that they have detailed inventory, condition data, data management plans, reporting format, life cycle costing, all of those things. That's the timeline for the estimated timeline, if you will, or suggested timeline for dealing with each one of those 12 asset groups.
Okay, so it's data collection. That doesn't indicate what kind of spending we're going to have to do.
No,
It's
that's
data
to develop a plan similar to what we have here.
This is going to give us a lot of data that we're going to be able to put into our open data, right?
It will hopefully give us good data that we can make good decisions with.
Okay, I want to go back to sanitary sewers. When I was here last week, I was really upset, as I have been for a number of years, as to what it's costing us.
Yes.
And I said that the figures we had for the first 6-8 months of the year indicated an unfavorable seepage of over $2 million. In talking to some of your engineering friends over the weekend, I found that the biggest factor here is that homes are connected for their stormwater to the sewers.
Yes.
And that's so you indicated that, when was it, 1980 that we changed prior to that, which is 55% of the homes in our community are on that old system?
Okay. January 1st, 1980 was when it became illegal to connect the house foundation drains into the sanitary system. By that time, we had about 52% of the current infrastructure in place, which translates into about 45,000 homes at that time.
That are still on that system?
That could be contributing, that are on the system
That are in all
and could be
likelihood.
contributing flow.
Yeah. Now, can we not do anything about that?
The answer is yes, if we are willing to do a couple of things. One is to enforce a bylaw or a regulation that will allow the city to enter private property and cause the disconnection of a foundation drain and the installation of a sump pump and sump pump system. What you're doing is you're changing a gravity solution for a mechanical solution that will then outlet to the stormwater system. What that means is that you have to be able to get into the house, you have to dig a hole in the basement, you have to get rid of the dirt, you have to dig outside of the basement to redirect the connections inward, you have to put in a sump pump, a mechanical system. Now, at this point, those homes don't worry too much if the power fails, because the groundwater continues to flow out the sanitary sewer. The only time that they have a problem is if the sanitary sewer surcharges and there's backflow. If the power goes out when you have a sump pump, unless you have a backup system, your sump pump will stop working and your basement will get flooded. So the first step would be to get permission from homeowners to make that disconnection. The second piece of that would be to install a storm service to the street and storm pipes along the street if there are no storm pipes.
Are we looking at anything like that?
The answer at this point is no.
Is it worthwhile looking at that?
In my estimation, and it's only my estimation, the answer is no. And I'll give you a very, very brief overview of why I say that. If we have approximately 45,000 homes that could be contributing flow, and let's say only 25,000 of those are contributing flows, to go into a home and to make all those changes could easily amount to $25,000 per home. That's a total of $625 million. And the cost to the city is $3 million a year. That's a 200-year solution.
Ms. Robinson, you want to add something?
Okay. If I may, the Township of Woolwich has spent the last 10 years looking at foundation drain connections. They have the same problem we have here, and in Elmira they have actually disconnected a number of streets. We've done extensive flow monitoring up there before and after, cost estimating, whatever. We have extensive data. Disconnecting foundation drains is about 10 times more expensive than dealing with the wastewater at the wastewater treatment plant. The other option, rather than putting in a third pipe gravity solution, is sump pumps, but there's a risk of flooding. So if a sump pump fails in a house that previously had a gravity connection, then the insurance, there's a risk to the municipality. So the foundation drain connections are a problem across North America, and there's no easy solution. I will say that we have started some I&I investigations in the city. We've started to do some flow monitoring, and the asset management group have a plan to go around the city with flow monitoring, and we will start to identify sources. These aren't always foundation drain sources. There are all kinds of sources of I&I. So we have initiated a program, but I can assure you that dealing with I&I is a long-term, it takes a long time, and it's not cheap to solve.
Nothing is. Thank you. Couple of questions on your roads. When I looked at the average of 68, I didn't think 68 was such a bad average. 68 out of 100.
No, I don't think anyone argues with that.
Well, so we're not in that bad a shape. I look at my street and I'm a 30. No, I've been there for 50 years, and nothing's ever happened. So a 68 for the whole city really isn't all that bad, is it?
The key is the backlog of work that we should be doing. A lot of the backlog, the deficit, if you will, is reconstruction. And those are streets that are deteriorating quickly, perhaps like yours.
But, and I can appreciate, but the point is, and you're obviously looking at that you can live with some of that. Yeah.
It's not a matter of my opinion. It's a matter of what the community feels they wish to have or deserve, and what this community can afford.
All right, thank you.
Okay, those are all the questions and comments. Thank you very much to everyone who put this together. It's obviously a very complex system. It's a very valuable system, and we clearly have to take it seriously to maintain it. So this is certainly going to help us over the many years to come. Thank you. One last item for the special council meeting, and that is simply to authorize the closed meeting, moved by Councillor Davies, seconded by Councillor Ioannidis. Those in favour? Opposed? That's carried. We will adjourn to the caucus room. And we're pretty well bang on time. Thanks, everyone.